days of Xerxes, the mighty king, who reigned from India to Kush, his glory did sing. 127 provinces wide, in Susa's citadel his splendor did reside. He called for a feast in the third royal year, a banquet of majesty for all nobles near. For 180 days they gazed in delight at the riches of Xerxes, his power, his might. Oh, the King of Kings on his royal throne, in the palace of Susa his wealth was shown. The feast of feasts in golden array, the glory of Persia on full display. In the court of the garden, where linens hung high, with cords of fine purple beneath Persia's sky, couches of silver, mosaics of stone, a kingdom of splendor Xerxes did own. Goblets of gold with wine overflowing, each cup unique, his bounty showing. No compulsion to drink, no law to obey, each man could choose his heart's own way. Oh, the King of Kings on his royal throne, in the palace of Susa his wealth was shown. The feast of feasts in golden array, the glory of Persia on full display. Queen Vashti too held her banquet of grace for the women of Persia in her royal space. The seventh day came, and the king did decree, bring Vashti before me, let her beauty be seen. But Vashti refused, her courage held strong. She would not parade where she did not belong. The king burned with anger, his pride was denied, the banquet of splendor now tarnished by pride. Oh, the banquet of the king, both beauty and power, a tale of a kingdom and a queen's fateful hour. From Susa's great halls the story would unfold, of a queen who said no, and a king's heart turned cold. The king in his fury called for the wise, men of law and wisdom to advise. Tell me, O sages, what must I do? Queen Vashti has refused my royal view. The laws of Persia were firm and great, no word of the king could dissipate. So Memucan spoke with a voice so clear, this act of the queen all women will hear. Let her crown be taken, her title erased, a decree be written for all to embrace. Honor the king, let respect be restored, let Vashti's defiance be known no more. Memucan declared, a new queen shall rise, one who brings joy and light to your eyes. Let the nobles proclaim throughout the land that women must honor their husband's command. This pleased the king and his royal court. The scribes were summoned, the law was wrought. To every province, in each tongue it was read. The decree of the king was swiftly spread. Let her crown be taken, her title erased, a decree be written for all to embrace. Honor the king, let respect be restored. Let Vashti's defiance be known no more. The letters were sent from east to west, in the name of Xerxes, the king's behest. Each man the ruler of his own domain, by law and order respect to retain. And so the chapter of Vashti closed, her royal crown forever deposed. But the seeds of a greater story were sown in the halls of Susa, where destiny is known. The king sought peace, his anger subsides, as the empire prepared for a new bride. When the time came for each to appear before King Xerxes, they drew near, prepared with treasures, their finest array, to present themselves in the royal way. Each woman could choose what she desired before the king, where dreams aspired. But Esther sought nothing beyond what was told by Hege's wisdom, worth more than gold. Esther found favor in the king's sight. Her beauty and grace shone bright as the light. Crowned as queen, her story began, chosen by God for a greater plan. In the 7th year of Xerxes' reign, Esther was crowned with joy to sustain. The king held a banquet, a feast so grand, for all his nobles across the land. He proclaimed a holiday, gifts were shared. The people rejoiced, the kingdom declared. A new queen reigns, her radiance supreme. Esther was lifted, fulfilling the dream. Esther found favor in the king's sight. Her beauty and grace shone bright as the light. Crowned as queen, her story began, chosen by God for a greater plan. Meanwhile, Mordecai stood at the gate, a faithful servant, aware of fate. He overheard a treacherous scheme. 2 guards conspired to shatter the king's dreams. Mordecai told Esther, who warned the throne. The plot was uncovered, the truth was shown. The king's life was saved and the record made. In the book of Chronicles, the deed was displayed. Through Esther's rise and Mordecai's stand, God's unseen hand moved across the land. After these events, Haman rose high, a man of ambition under Xerxes' sky. Promoted above all, his power was vast. The king's decree made his position steadfast. All bowed to Haman as the king had decreed, but Mordecai stood, refusing the deed. When questioned, he answered, steadfast and true, my faith and my God I must not subdue. Haman burned with anger, his pride defied. A plan of vengeance began to collide. Not just Mordecai, but his people too. Haman schemed destruction for the Jewish few. He approached King Xerxes with cunning and lies. There's a people scattered under your skies. Their laws are different, your rule they disdain. Let me destroy them for your kingdom's gain. The king took his signet, sealing the plan to annihilate Jews in every land. The date was cast, the lot was drawn. Adar the 12th, their fate would dawn. Haman burned with anger, his pride defied. A plan of vengeance began to collide. Not just Mordecai, but his people too. Haman schemed destruction for the Jewish few. The edict was written, the heralds proclaimed, death for the Jews by Xerxes' name. From province to province, fear spread wide, as Haman's wickedness could not be denied. But Mordecai mourned in sackcloth and dust, crying to heaven, in God he'd trust. The city was troubled, the people in pain. A cry for deliverance rose again.
Mordecai wept, in sackcloth he stayed at the palace gate, where no one prayed. The news of the edict spread far and wide, a decree of death, a nation's pride. Queen Esther heard of Mordecai's grief. Through Hathach she sought to find relief. What troubles you so? Tell me your plea. What message is this you're sending to me? For such a time as this, you were made to shine, to stand in the gap through God's design. Risk it all, for His purpose is clear. Deliverance will come, but your moment is here. Mordecai spoke with wisdom and might. Do not think you're safe in the palace's light. If you stay silent, help will arise, but you and your house may meet demise. Who knows, dear Esther, what this could mean? You may have been chosen to stand as queen, to save your people, to intercede, to act with courage in this time of need. For such a time as this, you were made to shine, to stand in the gap through God's design. Risk it all, for His purpose is clear. Deliverance will come, but your moment is here. Esther replied with resolve in her tone, I will approach the king, though I'm not known. If I perish, I perish, my life in His hand. I'll stand for my people as God has planned. 3 days of fasting, in unity they prayed. Esther prepared, her courage displayed. In faith she stepped where fear could tread, trusting the Lord for what lay ahead. For such a time as this, her story was told. A queen who was fearless, a heart that was bold. Through trials and danger, God's plan persists. On the 3rd day, Esther rose in grace. Dressed in royal robes, she took her place. To the king's court she made her way. Her heart was trembling, yet she chose to stay. King Xerxes looked and saw her stand, his scepter stretched forth in his hand. What is your request, my queen, my delight? Even half the kingdom I'll grant tonight. A step of faith, a queen so brave, for her people's life she sought to save. Before the throne her plea was made, God's unseen hand her courage displayed. If it pleases the king, Esther began, let you and Haman join me as planned. A banquet I've prepared for you today. There I'll reveal what I must say. The king agreed and Haman too. To Esther's feast their spirits flew. But the queen remained silent, her moment not near. She trusted in God to make her path clear. A step of faith, a queen so brave, for her people's life she sought to save. Before the throne her plea was made, God's unseen hand her courage displayed. That night as Haman's pride took flight, he saw Mordecai refusing his might. With anger burning he made a plan to hang Mordecai on a gallows grand. Yet Esther knew her time would come, a second banquet to reveal what was done. With wisdom and patience she held her ground. In her faith deliverance would soon be found. A step of faith, a story unfolds. A queen's bold move, her courage bold. God's timing perfect, His justice sure. Through Esther's faith, His people endure. That night the king could not find rest. His heart was stirred, his mind oppressed. He called for the chronicles, the records of old, to read through the deeds his servants had told. The scroll revealed Mordecai's name, who saved the king from a deadly scheme. What honor has he received? The king did ask. His servants replied, none for this task. In the still of the night, God's plan was inside. His justice moved through the dark of the night. For Mordecai's faith, the time had arrived to honor the man who kept the king alive. At that moment Haman came near. His wicked heart held plans severe. But the king asked first, what should be done for the one whom the king finds pleasure upon? Haman, thinking it must be he, described a reward with grandiosity. Dressed him in robes the king has worn, place him on a horse with a royal horn. Let him be led through the city square, proclaimed as honored beyond compare. The king agreed, then said with delight, do all of this for Mordecai tonight. In the still of the night, God's plan was inside. His justice moved through the dark of the night. For Mordecai's faith, the time had arrived to honor the man who kept the king alive. Haman's pride turned to despair as he led Mordecai through the square. With robes and honor the city could see, God's hand reversing the enemy's decree. Haman returned with his head hung low, his plans unraveling, his fate would show. But Esther prepared for the banquet ahead. At the second feast, the king reclined. Esther stood with a burdened mind. He asked her again, with love in his tone, what is your request? It shall be your own. Queen Esther spoke with a trembling voice, for my life, my king, I've made this choice. Spare my people, let them live. A wicked scheme no mercy gives. A queen so bold, her moment had come to save her people. God's will be done. Through truth and grace she made her stand. Justice was near by the king's command. The king grew angry, his fury burned. Who dares this evil, whose plot is confirmed? Esther replied, the foe is near. Haman himself, his guilt is clear. Haman trembled, his pride undone, as the wrath of the king weighed like the sun. The king rose up, in the garden he stayed, while Haman before Esther begged and prayed. A queen so bold, her moment had come to save her people. God's will be done. Through truth and grace she made her stand. Justice was near by the king's command. When the king returned, his rage grew high. Haman had fallen where Esther sat nigh. Would you assault the queen in my sight? Cried the king, sealing Haman's plight. Harbona spoke of the gallows tall. Haman's own plan, his prideful call. The king decreed, let him hang there for his evil plot and deadly snare. So Haman died on the gallows he made. Justice prevailed, the debt was paid. The wrath of the king was satisfied. Through Esther's faith, God's hand had replied. A queen so bold, her story complete. God's deliverance so bittersweet. Through courage and faith, his glory shone. In Esther's heart, his power was known. That same day, the king gave all Haman's estate to Queen Esther's call. Mordecai came before the throne, for Esther revealed he was her own. The king removed his royal ring. Once Haman's, now to Mordecai he'd bring. Over Haman's house Mordecai reigned, while Esther sought justice yet unclaimed. A decree of life to replace the pain. God's deliverance through Esther came. Through faith and courage, his people stood. His promises kept, his plan for good. Esther wept and fell at the king's feet. Reverse this plot, let justice meet. Save my people, undo this wrong. For their lives, O King, make justice strong. The king held out his scepter of gold, and Esther rose, her story told. Write a decree in the king's own name, that the Jews may fight and their lives reclaim. A decree of life to replace the pain. God's deliverance through Esther came. Through faith and courage, his people stood. His promises kept, his plan for good. In every province, the news was read. The Jews could fight, no longer dread. Rejoicing filled the hearts of men, as God's deliverance was seen again. Mordecai left the king's own side, clothed in royal blue and white. A golden crown adorned his head. The city of Susa rejoiced instead, for sorrow turned to joyous glee. On the 13th day of the 12th month, when the enemy's plan had begun to confront, the king's decree gave the Jews the right to gather and fight with all their might. In every province they took a stand. With swords in hand they made their command. No one dared oppose, no one could fight, for the Jews prevailed, their victory in sight. The tables turned, the fear did break. The Jews stood strong for their people's sake. The enemy's plan was thwarted by God's grace. Victory was theirs in every place. The king with the queen by his side asked, how many have fallen, how many died? Esther replied, the enemy's force has been destroyed by God's mighty course. The Jews in Susa their victory won. They struck down Haman's 10 sons. They rested their swords and gave God praise for his mighty power in their darkest days. The tables turned, the fear did break. The Jews stood strong for their people's sake. The enemy's plan was thwarted by God's grace. Victory was theirs in every place. The 10 sons of Haman hung on the trees as a sign of victory and God's decrees. The Jews rested, the fear had gone, for in God's strength they carried on. The day was done, but the Jews still stood. In Susa and beyond they did what was good. The king gave permission for the feast, to celebrate the victory and their peace. Esther's plea had been heard by the throne. God's deliverance to his people was shown. On the 14th and 15th they would feast, a day of rejoicing, a time of peace. The tables turned, the fear did break. The Jews stood strong for their people's sake. The enemy's plan was thwarted by God's grace. Victory was theirs in every place. On the 14th, the Jews did celebrate. Their victory was sweet, their joy so great. In every province they gave thanks and praise, for the Lord had delivered them from darker days. The feast was made, a time of cheer, to remember how God had brought them near. A day of gladness, a time to share the story of Esther, God's answer to prayer. Purim, the feast of victory so sweet, God's deliverance, his people's defeat. Through courage and faith, his hand was seen, the enemy's plan no longer between. Mordecai's fame spread far and wide, a man of honor with God. By his side he wrote a decree to keep the day, so the Jews would remember and always pray. Let Purim be kept with joy and praise, a reminder of how God saved these days, to celebrate the victory, the love, the grace, and God's mighty hand in every place. Purim, the feast of victory so sweet, God's deliverance, his people's defeat. Through courage and faith, his hand was seen, the enemy's plan no longer between. In every city, in every home, the Jews rejoiced no longer alone. They gave to the poor, they shared the feast. Their hearts were full, their joy increased. The fear was gone, replaced with peace. From the day of mourning to sweet release. And Mordecai rose, second in command, a faithful servant in God's great plan. God had turned the tables, made them whole, restored their lives, renewed their soul. And so the Jews in all lands did sing to honor their God, their Savior, their King. Purim, the feast of victory, so sweet, God's deliverance, His people's defeat. Through courage and faith, His hand was seen, the enemy's plan no longer between. Purim lives on, forever bright, a symbol of God's saving light. In the land of Susa, far away, a story unfolds that still speaks today. A queen named Esther, so brave and true, she stood for her people, her faith she knew. When the enemy's plans seemed dark and deep, she prayed and fasted, her trust in God to keep. Through courage and faith, she took her stand, and God used her in His mighty hand. A lesson in courage, a lesson in grace. God's plan will prevail in every place. With faith in our hearts and strength in our soul, we stand in God's purpose, and He makes us whole. Mordecai too, with wisdom and might, knew God was with them, He turned the night. He taught Esther to trust, to do what's right, for God's justice will always shine bright. Through trials and tears, through fears unknown, God's faithfulness stands, it's clearly shown. He lifts the humble, He defends the weak. Through every battle, He gives us peace. A lesson in courage, a lesson in grace. God's plan will prevail in every place. With faith in our hearts and strength in our soul, we stand in God's purpose, and He makes us whole. When the world feels dark and the road is tough, God's word is the light. When the way is rough, He raises us up. He hears our cries. In His strength we'll rise, we'll rise. Esther's story, it speaks to our hearts, of courage and faith, of playing our parts. No matter the challenge, no matter the cost, with God by our side, we'll never be lost. We trust in His plan, we trust in His grace. We stand for justice in every place. Like Esther and Mordecai, we know the way. With courage and